Hi everyone, this is Sam. So I'm just going to record the opening remarks here and then turn off recording once we move into the conversation portion. So you'll only see me on the recording, and if anybody wants to jump in and ask a question, they'll just hear your voice. So you should have received a notification. Can I get a thumbs up? I don't want to violate anyone's privacy. Okay, speaking of privacy. All right. So people are coming to the human condition with different levels of understanding of Hannah Arendt, her life, her work. And some have read this book before, some have read it a few times, some have never read it for the first time. I'm very jealous of you. This is the book that made me fall in love with Hannah Arendt's work when I was a college student many years ago, and follow her work. When I read the opening passages, I realized very quickly that I had no idea what she was talking about. And so I decided to take 9 directed studies in college and read all of her antecedents so that I could start to understand the human condition, because she was doing the work of political thinking in a way that was unfamiliar to me, having grown up reading Nietzsche and Marx and Locke and Rousseau. So that's how I came to this text initially. All right, who is Hannah Arendt? I'm going to do the really quick and dirty version of this, and then I'm going to say why I'm doing it and why I think it's important. So Hannah Arendt was born in Linden, Hanover, Germany in 1906. She was born to a well-established, assimilated German Jewish family. At the age of 3, her family moved to Königsberg, which was then the capital of East Prussia, because her father was dying of syphilis. He died when she was 7 years old, and she was raised by her mother, Martha. Her life was interrupted by World War I. They went to Berlin for a little over a year and then came back to Königsberg, where after about a year, she was expelled from school for leading a protest against one of her teachers because he offended her. Her mother tried to get her readmitted, but to no avail, because Hannah Arendt didn't actually like attending class. She didn't think one should have to study in the morning. It took her a very long time to wake up. She was very independent from an early age. She always felt herself to be a bit of an outsider. She goes to Berlin at the age of 16 to finish her studies on her own to prepare for college in Germany to take her exams. And that's where she meets an Italian theologian, Romano Guardini, who has a philosophical approach to theology. At different points in time, different political thinkers become, let's say, trendy. Hannah Arendt, we could say, is a trendy political thinker right now. In Hannah Arendt's day, it was Augustine. Arendt actually studied theology. When she was finishing her exams, her childhood friend, who she had learned Greek with, sent her a letter. Hannah, it's true. The rumors are true. Thinking has come to life. You have to come to Marburg and study with Martin Heidegger. Arendt went to Marburg, and she took Heidegger's first seminars on Aristotle and Plato. And yes, they had a relationship. No, I'm not going to talk about it. Um, but it is important in the constellation of her thinking, because Martin Heidegger is one of the fathers of German existentialism. And we'll see this in the human condition. We will see the influence of his writing on technology, on thinginess, on material in this work, along with poetics. The work on poetics and technology in particular, and language. Was ist Sprache? What is language? Arendt breaks up with Heidegger after a year. She spends 1 semester with Husserl, the great phenomenologist who had been Heidegger's teacher, before going to do her dissertation on St. Augustine at the University of Heidelberg with Karl Jaspers, the other father of existentialism. So what this means is that Arendt received her formal education and training from the 2 German fathers of existentialism. There are lots of debates about whether or not Arendt is an existentialist. I tend not to think of her in those terms. I think of her as a phenomenological materialist for reasons that I'm happy to talk about. It's a strange phrase, but for me, it helps to capture what it is that she's doing within the tradition of Western political philosophy. Arendt publishes her dissertation at the age of 23, and then she becomes a reporter in Berlin, where she is writing book reviews and doing research for her second book, which is required to get a teaching position in Germany on German Romanticism and Rahel Varnhagen, who had been a disciple of Goethe. Arendt falls in love with her first husband, Gunther Anders, and they move to Frankfurt so that he can do his Habilitation, or second book, with the Institute for Social Research under the direction of Adorno, Theodor Adorno, and Paul Tillich, what is today known as the Frankfurt School. Adorno denied him his work, and they were forced to leave after a year. But Arendt formed lifelong friendships with Paul Tillich and Mannheim, among others. In 1933, after the burning of the Reichstag that February, Arendt says that she will no longer be a bystander, that she doesn't want anything more to do with the intellectual class. And she is, her husband leaves her in Berlin because he is forced to flee after Bertolt Brecht's address book is confiscated by the Gestapo. Arendt stays. Her mother comes from Königsberg, and together they turn their apartment into a kind of stop to help communists get out of Germany before they're arrested. At the same time, she's recruited to do research for the World Zionist Organization by her friend Kurt Blumenfeld. She is to collect examples of anti-Semitic propaganda to be used at the conference that was to be held that summer in Prague, but that never happened, and to be sent to world leaders to let them know how bad things were in Germany at the time. After a couple of months of doing this work in the library, which is where she had been working anyway on her book, she's arrested one day walking down the front steps on her way to meet her mother for lunch. She's held by the Gestapo for a little over a week, and by mere luck, as she describes it, she is released. She flees the next day. She spends about 9 years in exile in Paris doing work for Jewish organizations to help Jewish youth escape to Palestine. She goes there in 1935. She doesn't want to live on the Kibbutzim. She doesn't like them. She goes back to Paris. In the spring of 1940, she is interned in Gurs in the south of France. By now, she's divorced her first husband, met and married her second husband, Heinrich Blücher, who was a Marxist, who had no formal education, and who was not Jewish. Her mother hated him. He had fought on the streets of Berlin with the Spartacus League. He was very political, very charismatic, very handsome. Arendt and her husband are sent to different internment camps. Arendt is in the south in Gurs on the Spanish border. Blücher ends up in the north. And after about 6 weeks, Arendt is able to escape with 62 other women and forged documents. She walks out of the camp alone, and she walks across France on foot to find Walter Benjamin, who was a great cultural critic of the 20th century and had been a dear friend of hers. And together they hear that refugees are meeting up in Montbon. So Arendt makes her way there, and one day, walking down the street, she sees her husband in the middle of the street. Pure chance. They're able to reunite. They spend some time there waiting to see if they can get papers. They get bicycles and they make their way to Marseille, where eventually, with the help of Barry and Fry, they're able to secure American emergency exit visas. Arendt arrives in the United States on May 22nd in 1941. She's barely 30, she's not even 35. She has $25 and she does not speak English. She says she knows a few lines of Shakespeare. She spends her first summer in America as a housekeeper to learn English through a program. That fall, she goes to Columbia University and finds Salo Baron, who had escaped Germany in 1933, and set up the first Jewish studies program in America. He invites her to write an essay for his journal, Social Studies. And with his help, she begins her writing career in America. I'm telling you this story about her because for Arendt, it's impossible to divorce her life from her work. Jerry Cohn, who passed unfortunately a couple of months ago, was a great mentor to me, told me once that she became a writer by accident. Arendt says that writing is part of the process of understanding. She wrote in order to understand what was happening. She spends those 10 years between 1941 and the publication of The Origins of Totalitarianism in 1951, teaching classes on European history, writing book reviews, working in publishing in New York, and working for a Jewish organization helping to find property that had been stolen by the Nazis. So Arendt, it's easy to think of Arendt as this very serious thinker in black and white, kind of, bent over the table smoking, in her head all the time. But I'm also saying this because I think it's important in approaching her work, especially this book, which is so much about political action and the importance of action and natality and new beginnings and what is possible, that she was always politically active her entire life. When she decided to turn away from that intellectual milieu in 1933, it's because she thought the world of professional thinkers, whose job it was to think about how one should act, were the least prepared to act in times of emergency and crisis, because they had constructed these intellectual worlds around themselves, which were divorced from reality. And so when she comes to write The Human Condition in 1958, this question is very much at the forefront of her mind. This question of how to think about thinking in relationship to action, right? The vita contemplativa and the vita activa, for those who have been watching my videos, and putting them on the same plane with one another, and thinking about the life of action from what it means to be a human being in this world and to act in this world and to think from experience. All thinking moves from experience and nothing else for Arendt. She does not ascribe to any sort of transcendental thinking. She is always, this is how I put it to myself, she's always planting our feet on the ground and trying to get us to look at what is right in front of us. And that's the question of Amor Mundi, which is what she initially wanted to title this book, Love of the World. And her question was, why is it so difficult to love the world? And we could rephrase that to think, why is it so difficult to see what's right in front of us? Why don't we want to look at it? And the question that she asks more directly in that vein, which is, why is it so difficult to love the world with all of the suffering and evil in it? Right? What does it mean to face the world? When she goes to the trial of Adolf Eichmann, she says, I want to come face to face with evil. Right? For her, it was very important to be face to face with, and if you think back to that story of Thales and the philosopher looking up at the stars who trips and falls in the well and is laughed at by the little Thracian girl, it's also, I think, important to remember that Arendt is that little Thracian girl, right? It's not only that horrible, terrible, violent things can happen in the world, whether or not we look away at them, but that it is important for her to assume that position of critical distance, to stand face to face, allowing for that in-betweenness, so that one as an individual can make a judgment in the world with others. I will say, for those of you who are studying philosophy, there's quite a few of you here tonight in this room. this isn't necessary to understand, but I'll just add it in. Arendt is very much following Kant here. I read her as very much following Kant on the question of existence and thinking about how concepts must correspond to reality. Arendt, you'll notice, is talking about the world of appearances, right? And we appear in the world with others and are conditioned by everything that we come into contact with. Kant's question of existence in the Critique of Pure Reason is a rejection of Descartes, right? And Arendt, in her own way, is also rejecting Descartes for divorcing our senses from reality. Or to put that another way, for Arendt, we go out in the world. We experience the world with our senses. I see things, I hear things, I touch things, I taste things, I smell things. And I can tell a story about those experiences I have, which become the raw material of my thinking. Arendt was very wary of any sort of philosophy or ideology or way of thinking that tried to divorce thinking from reality. So if there's a way of thinking that gives you a Procrustean frame or kind of framework that you can hold up to an experience you've had so that it makes sense, for Arendt, that's dangerous, right? That means that you are no longer relying upon yourself to understand your own experiences. You're looking outside of yourself to make sense of your experiences. And so when we get to the section on work, and she's talking about poetry and storytelling and what we build, these are creative acts that come from within the self, from making what is from bridging that invisible realm of the mind to the world of appearances. So concepts must correspond to what's real. And you'll notice that this book is a book of concepts. Auden said that it was so fantastic to read because she was giving us a vocabulary. She was giving us a language in order to think with, to think about the world that we share together. And so she's really trying to think about the material relationship between the language that we're using and the activities that we are engaging in. What happens when there's a slippage between an activity like labor and work? And why is the distinction so important for Arendt? And why is it so important at this time? In part because of what she sees as the danger of the rise of mass society, the loss of the commons, the rise of the social, and the loss of distinction between private and public, which erodes our ability to think and to think for ourselves. So those are just some overarching remarks. And hopefully I'm trying to speak a little bit to some of the points that people raised in introductions and what's bringing them to this book in particular. I want to just put labor on the table a little bit, and this is the last thing I'll say and then I'll stop talking, is that Arendt intended for this book to be a big book on Marx. And she tried to write a book about Marx and she couldn't quite do it. It's now been published as part of the critical edition. So you can see all of her notes and lecture notes on Marx and what was there and what kind of makes it into the text and what doesn't make it into the text. But she in part wants to write this book on Marx in order to save him for Karl Jaspers, which she writes in a letter to her teacher, Karl Jaspers. Karl Jaspers thought Marx was evil. He was Satan incarnate. He didn't want anything to do with him. But Arendt saw a kind of trend emerging, which is that people wanted to blame the rise of totalitarianism on the tradition of Western philosophy, on thinkers like Nietzsche, nihilism, Marx, socialism, communism. And Arendt says, this isn't quite right. It's not that there's nothing there, but it's not the right way to think about it. So she says, if we want to blame Marx for the rise of Hitler, we might as well blame Plato. Like, this doesn't make any sense. That's an actual quote, a little taken out of context. But for her, she wanted to approach Marx as a very serious thinker because she thought he was doing what all great thinkers do, which was trying to understand the world that he lived in at the time, specifically the way in which labor had been transformed by the Industrial Revolution, by technology, and how the transformation of labor, how the transformation of everyday activity changed the human condition, changed the way that we could think about those fundamental questions of metaphysics, like what is being? What does it mean to be a person in the world with others? What she didn't like about Marx was that he elevated labor to both man's supreme capacity and then developed an argument that ideally we could liberate ourselves from the need to labor. For Arendt, the problem with Marx is in this need to liberate ourselves from the need to labor. For Arendt, not only can we not liberate ourselves from the need to labor, but when we try to do that, historically, it hasn't led to good things. And what she's trying to bring us back to is this understanding that labor is part of the human condition because it's the part of our life that corresponds to our biology, that corresponds to the fact that we are conditioned by our bodies as human beings that need to eat and sleep and reproduce, and also the earth that we inhabit, which conditions what it is that our bodies physically and materially need. So for Arendt, it's not that labor is our supreme capacity. It's that work is the activity that we can engage in that will add something to the world, that will allow us to create something that will last, which is in contradiction for her with Marx's idea that labor is the creator of man. So in the economic and philosophic manuscripts, for those who haven't read Marx or haven't read Marx in a while, Marx argues that when we sell, so different political thinkers have different understandings of our kind of fundamental capacities, right? So for Marx, it's our ability that I can take my hands and I can transform the raw material of the earth into an object that exists, that I can make something, right? This is my creative power. And Marx says in the manuscripts that if I sell my labor power for a wage, that I have liquidated my soul. Right. So this is how he frames it. And then this leads to his definition of alienation, right? That when we sell our labor power in exchange for a wage, that we become alienated laborers. We're alienated from the objects that we make because we don't own them. We're alienated from the tools that we use to make the objects because we don't own those either. We're alienated from the objects as we encounter them in the world because they've been made by other alienated laborers. The classic example is the baker who goes to the bread shop and can't buy a loaf of bread. Okay. And then we encounter one another as individuals who have been, who are alienated laborers. Arendt's trying to break all of this down in the section on labor and to find that space between two human beings that's not mediated by economy or technology or any sort of productive capital. And so I'm going to end on this question. We can ask it as a question, is what kind of human interaction is free from, let's say, any form of monetary value, productivity, and so on. Okay. I think that was about 15 minutes. I'm going to stop the video now.